If you've been around the RPG scene that long, you've probably heard of a thing called progress clocks. Well, they came from Blades in the Dark, and we are going to talk about why they are the best game mechanic ever made. So the old progress clocks, what are they? Well, they're essentially round drawings with different segments in them, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and the game master will use them to mark off incremental movements towards a certain thing happening. To give you an example, the players are sneaking into a mansion at night, but the mansion is being patrolled by guards at all times. Rather than the guards being alerted by a single failed roll, a guard alert clock will be created. So then every failure or consequence can add to that eventually happening. This honestly plugs so many holes in role-playing games that have come before Blades. GMs have always had to solve this problem that they've had where they either make the game way too difficult so any action roll can completely ruin the mission, or they have to go the video game route and they have to pretend that guards are stupid and any consequence or nothing that they notice is they'll have to just forget about it in 30 seconds. So in game, progress clocks' advantages are twofold. One, they give the DM an easy answer to player consequences, which will be generated on a roll of 1 to 5, so it's good to have something to fill in with consequences as they happen in the score. And 2, it ratchets up the tension in the score. Remember what I said in the narrative episode, Blades is all about that runaway train feeling of generating drama and suspense. There are many other uses for the clocks as well. You can use them to represent long-term projects that the players are doing over time between missions. In scores, it can represent particularly challenging things or even particularly challenging enemies. We have to fill the clock to be able to defeat them. I think the reason why they work so much better in Blades instead of other games where I've seen people trying to force them into those systems is because Blades is all about reducing as much planning as possible. We want the players in Blades to play their characters like they're driving stolen cars, aka with reckless abandon, and they're not going to do that if they know that being seen by one guard is going to screw the entire score. In a way, the progress clocks kind of trick the players into being more brave and daring than they otherwise would be because they're having to race against this clock. We have the traditional issue of the group of players standing in front of the door trying to listen at it for 20 minutes to find out what's on the other side. If there's a ticking clock happening in the background, they're going to try and make things go faster. So you don't have to. You can also heighten the immersion of the game a considerable amount. I mean, how many times have you GM'd a game and there's supposed to be this sort of feeling of urgency, but it's just not there? You know, so if players start doing stuff like looting corpses or rifling through cabinets, you can tick a clock and say, time has passed, that thing that is going to happen is getting closer. This also provides a very good ballast to Blades' other core mechanic, which is the action rolls. Because in the action rolls, I mentioned last time, they can kind of do everything in one go. If you want to beat up one guard, it's one action roll. If you want to pick a pocket or convince someone to do something, it's just one action roll. However, with clocks, you can make a single action or activity stretch out into several rolls. So if you're climbing a particularly tall building, progress clock. If your players are trying to convince a group full of gang members to join them instead of another faction, progress clock. If they're trying to wrestle a runaway carriage to a full stop, working together, yeah, it's going to be a progress clock that they can all attribute to. If needed, a progress clock can simulate the success and progress of an entire score. If you have a group of smugglers, for example, a progress clock could literally mark the progress of them being able to get from A to B without having enough trouble that they ruin the score. If you have a smuggling crew, for example, every time they get past an obstacle, you can tick the clock, and then when they fulfill the clock, that is them being able to get to the end of the score. You may then have another clock, which is called lost loot. So every time there's a complication or an obstacle, they have to add more segments to the clock, so they are potentially losing out the faster they're going. So are there any downsides to the clocks? Well, in that example that I just mentioned with the smuggling score, the players being able to see exactly when they will complete the score will allow them to have a feeling of being safe. If they know danger is 4, 6, 8 segments away, then they know that they actually have some breathing room to go and do other things before the guards ultimately find them. which doesn't really fit with the fiction. Like, you don't know when you're going to be spotted by a guard, you don't know when the next one's going to come around the corner, so it can give that feeling of safety that you probably don't want on a score. However, it's not always necessarily a bad thing. Players love to solve problems, and if they're gamers and they probably are used to having those kind of 3 rounds left, you need to do these things, that's quite a fun puzzle-y kind of element to solve. Sometimes the players will know exactly how much time they have, and as an audience we should also know, because that's fun, right? There's always a ticking clock on a bomb in a movie for a reason. So my advice on that front would be always make sure that the clocks are representing the narrative and the fiction, and you're describing it as such. Don't make the progress clock like the enemy HP in D&D. Don't let the players focus too much on the numbers and make them just a sack of hit points, not to reduce the score to a whole series of box ticking exercises. As it's based on the narrative, make sure all the players know what happens when the clock is filled, how is it being filled, and also if they can even reverse it or stop it in any way. And my final bit of advice on progress clocks is don't hold back on the consequences of the clock being filled. I'm guilty of this, of being a bit softly with my players, with consequences and harm and bad things happening, but the progress clock is very transparent. The players will know when it's going to be completed, and they can see how close they're getting to that. If they don't work to avoid the consequence, then I think it's fair game that something significantly bad might happen. And that is progress clocks in a nutshell. Let me know what you think about progress clocks. Do you use them a lot? Do you use them a bit less? Did you fall out with them? Do your players like them? Do they find them useful? Do you try and use them in other games, and which games have they actually worked in? Which ones they haven't worked in? Some games probably do them better than D&D, for example. I imagine D&D you could use them a little bit, but I can't really see it working that well. Also, let me know what you'd like me to cover in a future video. If there's something that you've been struggling to understand, or if you've just been enjoying general Blades content, then yeah, just let me know. And on that, I will see you in the next video. Until then.